All right, I'm here with Alan to talk about stories, of course, with the big one being Mudge blows the whistle. But first, Alan's got a privacy lawsuit against Oracle.
Yes, it's a big privacy lawsuit filed by three individuals. It's a class action lawsuit. And I didn't really know about the extent of Oracle's privacy invading companies and practices, but apparently it's quite extensive. This is entirely separate from its traditional database products. But instead, it turns out that they own a number of um, well known data mining companies such as Blue Kai, and that they're using this to very extensively harvest people's information for sales opportunities. And so these three plaintiffs have brought a civil suit, class action suit against Oracle, and it's one of actually a set of unrelated lawsuits, two of which have been filed in the EU and are not looking too good at this point, strangely enough. So in the link here for today's podcast, it's a Twitter thread from a fellow by the name of Robert Bateman, who works for GRCWF, which is strangely enough a risk management and risk analysis company that does a lot of educational events in the UK. And he provides a very interesting analysis of this huge, potentially huge lawsuit, starting out with the fact that this suit was not brought under the CCPA, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act, which apparently, while good in principle and name, actually makes it rather difficult to successfully bring a suit against a potentially offending company. Instead, what they allege in this lawsuit is that Oracle is collecting a lot of data from people who have no way of opting out, that Oracle is using this data to build profiles of users, and then it then has a data marketplace, and then it is acting as a data broker, and all this without any kind of consent being given by the billions of people. In fact, in this lawsuit, it's claimed that Oracle has profiles on 5 billion people around the world, and that this data that they've got is in many ways very, very invasive. In fact, the plaintiffs in this case didn't have to try very hard to find evidence of this. They use Oracle's own promotional materials that show that it's possible to identify an individual based on some very private potential information like life events and health and emergency medicine. So the insinuation there being that Oracle's hoovering up data on what people might be looking for online and evidence that, for example, they have a serious health condition.
Hmm.
Now, one might say, well, Google does this all the time. How is this different from Facebook? I don't know all the specifics of this lawsuit. And of course, there are other lawsuits against Google and Facebook too. But I think the insinuation here is that Oracle perhaps has a greater degree of this and is even less scrupulous in its sales to customers, and that they've received less scrutiny than other companies that, in fact, have been penalized or been subject to consent decrees and so on and so forth. So it's a big deal. This is a very big deal.
Yeah, it sounds like they're much more extensive in their collection. This is what people have been warning us about for 10 years, is that all these private companies are collecting all this data with no oversight and no legal limits, apparently.
Right, and that the CCPA doesn't really work, and that even in the EU, they aren't able to effectively enforce this. It comes down to the fact that they're operating in a legal gray area, and they are making money off of that. But in the meantime, they've also collected an enormous amount of data on people, everything from their location to their politics to their medical conditions. It's all in there. They already have that information, and apparently it's the evidence for this is very strong. It's not circumstantial. It's like it's plainly out there
Yep.
Oracle's claiming this in their promotional materials, and the plaintiffs have also figured out ways to extract information from Oracle that shows that some of the data that's being held, that Oracle holds on the plaintiffs themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it sounds important.
It is, I think. Yeah.
And of course, the other one that's getting a lot of excitement is Mudge blowing the whistle on Twitter and filing for apparently whistleblower protection, joining some organization that protects whistleblowers. My first thought is this will be the end of his career, I would think. Maybe he's ready for retirement. I mean, but after you hire you as the chief security officer at Twitter, and then you expose all their security problems, I just tell all my students, this is what you don't do. They hire you to avoid becoming a scandal. So I would think no one's going to trust him at a corporation after this. He might be able to work for independent oversight agencies like Citizens Work Group. Anyway, but he was hired and didn't spend very long at Twitter. And, he came in at a time of great chaos in the management when the original founder, Jack Dorsey, was sort of stepping down and moving away from it. And but anyway, his claims are quite extreme. He claims that they never complied with, Twitter has been hacked many, many times, had many, many security breaches, and they were punished in 2010 by the Federal Trade Commission and had a consent decree that forced them to be audited and improve their security practices. And his claim is they did not improve their security practices after 2010. Half their servers are out of date and unpatched. And he also claimed that half of the entire employee base at Twitter has effectively administrative rights over the servers, which is pretty insane. And that's why there was a recent attack where just a teenager called a Twitter employee, managed to social engineer them into letting them get in people's accounts. Apparently, many people at Twitter can just get in people's accounts, and they don't really delete data when you delete your account like they say they do. And he says that a Twitter employee was convicted this month of using his position in the company to spy on Saudi dissidents and government critics, passing this information on to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and that the Indian government forced Twitter to put an Indian agent on the payroll with access to user data so they could monitor Twitter to keep track of protests. So this is really kicked over a can of worms, and Chuck Grassley in the Senate is going to have hearings and something about this, claiming that Twitter is a national security risk because of their infiltration by foreign agents. So this is going to have big echoes going on, and we'll see. Twitter is defending themselves with what look like sort of standard boilerplate statements like, oh, there are other controls he didn't consider, and these are inaccurate statements or something. So not very convincing. And
not at all. Not at all. They're trying very hard to discredit him, it seems, without being too overt.
They are, in fact. Well, I think even explicitly saying that trying to discredit Mudge, I think, is hopeless. I mean, Mudge has had a great reputation for 30 years in the world of cybersecurity.
Yeah, I was surprised they were able to hire him in the first place.
I was surprised they did hire him because I was kind of afraid this would happen. I mean, if you have a real activist kind of a security person won't claim in, then he's going to expect to clean up shop. And if you don't, they'll be held to pay.
I wouldn't call him an activist, though. I mean, yes, sure, in the 90s, he was very much part of the hacker underground with Loft. But since then, he went much more mainstream. After all, he was working for the US government at the DARPA.
Well, yeah, but DARPA is kind of the wild men. And, his big thing, which I heard him propose for years, was that they would have cyber UL listing where they put a label on the product so you'd know they met a certain standard. And somehow that still never happened. But it was a good idea.
Good idea.
He seemed unable to ever make it really happen.
Yeah. I mean, it's still early goings. We're only hearing the first allegations, but it seems like he does have very strong grounds for this whistleblower allegation.
Yeah, and he said that he has real experience at other big corporations, and he says what they're doing here is not normal. This is much worse than you should have at a corporation like this, and I think he is well qualified to make that judgment.
Yeah, and the evidence is there. Twitter keeps getting hacked all the time.
They do. So anyway, I think this will, and by the way, he also says that what Elon Musk said about bots is true. In fact, Twitter is covering up the number of bots on the platform that are a lot worse than they say they are. which is
Which
just what
shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody who uses Twitter.
well, I don't see that many of them, but anyway, it's but I see other people have huge complaints about Twitter, and I just don't experience all these negative things.
Well, this is going to have some implications for Elon Musk trying to wriggle out of his deal.
Oh,
So,
yes, I think it'll help him.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it might also have big implications for investors because, well, aside from the bot numbers, which potentially affect Twitter's revenue, I mean, this company does not look very competent. One last thing that Mudge alleges is that the company almost lost everything in 2021.
Oh, I didn't notice that.
Yeah, because apparently they like their infrastructure is terrible, and so they lost one data center, and they almost lost a second. And had they lost that second, then they would have lost everything. Like every single tweet would have just disappeared all at once, and it took some truly heroic engineering to revive everything, bring it back on. But yeah, it seems like it's just it's dysfunctional at many levels.
Yeah, I mean, their management has been famously dysfunctional for years. That's why, I mean, Twitter's actual value has been pretty much too high. I mean, they never make much money. The management has been fighting among themselves and notoriously negligent and incompetent. And the current price of Twitter, from what I understand, is just driven up by the possibility that Musk might pay all that money to buy it.
Yes.
And so the real price, it varies on every day in the news how much they think Musk is really going to be forced to buy it. So, but I would imagine Twitter's stock is going to fall as a result
More
of
than
this.
a little, yeah.
Yeah. Yep. I'm glad I don't own any Twitter. Anyway, I do use Twitter all the time, and I like it, like I think everybody. But it's famously a disaster inside. And before this, I used Yahoo, which was also famously a disaster inside. This seems to be quite the case, that you have these important internet structures that are just sort of thrown together sloppily, poorly managed, and yet we all use them like crazy.
Yeah, and you would think at some point they would just clean up their act, become more professional. I mean, it's been around for a while now.
But there's technical debt, right? You have all this established structure set up the wrong way, and it's so much bother to fix it.
Right, and of course that would be an enormous engineering challenge, but even just from a management and organizational standpoint, it's just far worse than it needs to be.
Well, yeah, but usually from what I can tell, the only time a company really cleans up their act is usually when they get acquired by a bigger company.
Mm.
And that hasn't happened. And I don't know if anybody would buy Twitter.
We're waiting for Papa Musk then, I guess.
Yeah, that's true. If he took over, maybe he'd clean things up. Anyway,
I doubt it.
Yeah, or just make it worse.
Yes.
All right. Now let's go back to you. You got Blake Masters. That guy I hear a bit about these days.
Yeah, Blake Masters, who is now the Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate seat in Arizona. Mother Jones has a very lengthy profile on Blake Masters and his relationship with Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel, of course, being a very prominent Silicon Valley investor, co-founder of PayPal, very early investor in Facebook. The guy is rich, very rich, and interestingly, very politically active too, and famously so for well over a decade, 15 years now. Peter Thiel has been active, maybe not necessarily directly in American politics, but he's been very outspoken in his views and beliefs as a libertarian. But
and I think donating a lot of money.
And donating a lot of money. That's right. He's more recently become more directly involved in American politics, to the tune of about $15 million in the case of Blake Masters' Senate candidacy. Musk has also supported Josh Hawley of Missouri, and also donated, I think, $13 million to J.D. Vance's Ohio Senate candidacy. So he's throwing a lot of money into just this cycle of elections. And so this article here in Mother Jones really traces both Blake Masters life story and his relationship with Peter Thiel. And there's quite a lot in here. It's a real doozy. Without getting into the very lengthy specifics, really what the article is talking about is the political views of this pair of guys. And this is not mainstream Republican ideology. Let's put it that way. It's not even mainstream libertarian ideology. Both of them have rather extreme views, very extreme views, anti-democratic views, really. And Masters has even gone further to the right in the past than he was in the past. Like, for example, he was supportive of abortion rights. Now he's very much against that. So a lot of these formerly, I guess you could say, civil libertarian views that Masters may have espoused have gone by the wayside. And in the meantime, his views on government and economics have become only more extreme over time.
Well, I've never quite been able to figure out what Peter Thiel wants, but what I assume, because he's one of these rich guys, what he probably wants is low tax and no government regulation. But what else would he want?
Well, I can bring in an article about this, or actually an opinion piece about Peter Thiel next time. But there are indications that Peter Thiel isn't just a libertarian, that he's actually a full-on fascist. And that he's always been rather hard libertarian, but his views have gotten even harder more recently. And he has made some public statements. Actually, he's had statements going back years in which he's openly dismissive of democracy, and that he's explicitly in favor of, well, basically fascist government structures.
Well, that's, I guess, the mainstream Republican position now with the elections in Iowa. We should just have a king.
Yeah, I mean, which sounds so ridiculous, but there's more and more evidence to support that.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that for big business, that's even more efficient and stuff.
Yeah.
Then you just have to bribe one guy and you can do whatever you want.
This is true. This is true. I mean, if you're a billionaire, I guess your outlook on the world has changed somewhat. And if you're going to act in your own self-interest, as libertarians are always reminding people that that's human nature, then that's just what you're going to do. And
well,
fascism,
I think a billionaire, I think a billionaire doesn't need anyone else to build the roads or run the police force or anything, and they feel like that's just a waste of money.
Right, right.
Yeah. All right. Well, GitHub has Copilot, which will suggest code to you, and they say it has gotten so good that it will fill in code. And they say the one immediate consequence is it will totally do your homework for you in any programming class, any language you want. You can just give it a description. They said, in fact, they trained it on all the programming textbooks and all the programming homework assignments they could find. So it's totally got the answer ready for any homework assignment you might give your coding class. And so that seems like the smaller side. But anyway, I think in general, this is great. But I've been hearing for 10 years, they're going to have just like Clippy would pop up and suggest words for your Word document. They'll have GitHub Copilot say, here, write this code. And you just examine it and polish it a little bit, which is pretty much all most coders do anyway. That's certainly what I do. You go to like Stack Exchange and copy something and modify it a little. This just sort of automates the process and makes it better. So he said, students armed with Copilot will be bringing Uzis to a knife fight. And
well, I like the idea. I certainly appreciate it, given my level of coding ability.
It could only make my coding better. I'm famous for the most god-awful code. My students come to look at it are horrified and get over any respect they might have had for me and such. So,
and I guess this really does give more credibility to the idea of no code programming being a real thing.
Yeah, well, AI was supposed to step up, and it seems like we're really entering the time when AI is really like available and practical and helpful.
Maybe so. I wonder what all those bros who've been saying just learn to code will do now.
Well, you learn to manage the bot.
I guess so.
I think that's fine. Anyway, All right. And you've got Google Teller.
Yes, there's a very interesting project up on GitHub called Google Teller by a fellow who goes by the name or handle of Bert Hubert. And he's also got a little video up on Twitter. It's a simple tool. It will just make a little buzzing, beeping sound every time you're, say, typing into your browser address bar and some data is sent to Google. And as you can see in the video, there's a lot of traffic going to Google all the time as you're typing into the address bar, as you're on, in his case, in the demo video, I think it's the Netherlands Job or Employment Board or something like that. You just mouse over certain links and you hear the little beeps, and you just scroll down the page and mouse over other links, hear more beeps. It's all but constant. And I mean, of course, there are other ways. This is nothing new. There are other ways to surface all of this traffic to Google, like Wireshark. But if you have an audio indicator live as you're doing it, I have to say, it's really compelling, because you realize just how much traffic is going straight to Google. It is alarming. Just going back to the first story about Oracle and all the data harvesting that Oracle's doing. I mean, that's Google's business model right there. So
Yeah, I think this is very helpful to make it easy for people to understand it's easy to imagine that you're alone on your computer, but in fact, there's a bunch of people watching everything you do.
as it turns out, yes. And you don't even have to click on anything.
Right. And, like it came out last week, TikTok, the app inserts JavaScript into every page you load inside the TikTok app to record your keystrokes and everything.
Yeah.
So they can technically be doing it, and a bunch of them are, and then you don't know what they're doing with the data. But this Oracle lawsuit strongly suggests that what they're doing with the data is pretty much the worst case scenario.
Surveillance capitalism. It's a real thing.
Yep. I think it's very helpful to make it easy for people to understand how much you're being spied on. Right. And there was a study, people talked about, if we do colonize Mars, which seems to be a terrible idea. But anyway, you would have to terraform it first, and you have to start by growing some plants. And they've discovered that alfalfa will grow on Mars. They created a simulated conditions like Mars on Earth as much as they could, and discovered that alfalfa can grow. And it's the best thing to grow, because after the alfalfa dies, it's the dead alfalfa plant provides the necessary fertilizer for other crops to grow. So in our quest to terraform other planets, which, by the way, speaking of those crazy libertarians, I've read an article recently that said this is probably where all the libertarians are going to space, because they're figuring out how fast we're destroying Earth. And they're thinking, well, I could leave. So anyway, the billionaires are going to space. Anyway,
good riddance. Let them go.
Well, the fact is they pretty much have to destroy that. The fact is leaving is very impractical. There's nowhere you could get to in any reasonable amount of time that would be worth living on. So this would have to be a somewhat altruistic thing. If we plant enough alfalfa on Mars, then maybe in 1,000 years, somebody can move there.
Well, I like alfalfa sprouts. I could eat more of them in my life.
Oh, yeah. Alfalfa is a good start. It reminds me of a story my father told me decades ago. Like in 1950, a rumor went around. He was in a stock market, and they said, buy American alfalfa. And he looked, and American alfalfa was selling for $20, and it had been selling at $20 for 5 years. So he didn't buy it. And then next month, chlorophyll hit the market. Chlorophyll toothpaste, chlorophyll chewing gum, chlorophyll mouthwash, and American alfalfa jumped up to $40 and sat there. So he missed his chance. Anyway, other than that, I think alfalfa is only used for animal feed. I don't think humans eat it much except in the form of sprouts.
Well, it's tasty enough. Speaking of which, I haven't seen it in the grocery stores in a while. I wonder if it's still widely available.
Yeah, I got some sprouts. I think they were clover sprouts now, but I know there's sometimes alfalfa sprouts. All right. Well, anyway, that's it for this one, and we'll be back on Friday.